I'll just say a few words about Andrew by way of introduction. He's professor of philosophy at the University of Scranton in Pennsylvania, as he was just telling us. And he's published on Duns Scotus, the singular voice of being, Duns Scotus, An Ultimate Difference, out in 2019. He's co-editor with Richard A. Lee Jr. of the Edinburgh Critical History of Philosophy of the Middle Ages and Renaissance Philosophy. And he's currently completing a manuscript entitled Materialism's Antechamber, Nominalism and the Problem of Universals Between Medieval and Continental Philosophy. His title for now is, for today's talk, is What Becomes of Bucephalus? And Conway on the Plasticity of Nature, Ranterism and Divine Justice. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you. As you'll see immediately from my title, this is a new project, and so the title is already changed as well. So I'll hopefully make sense of all of this. Both contemporary analytic and continental philosophy have increasingly registered dissatisfaction with standard materialist frameworks. This has led to rethinking the bounds of materialism. To simplify matters, I will say that reductive and mechanistic accounts now share the stage with more plastic and vitalistic materialisms. But as far as I know, the engagement of both traditions with Anne Conway's Principles of Most Ancient and Modern Philosophy has been, at best, limited. This is regrettable for several reasons, one of which I will address here. Blending together a variety of disparate and seemingly antagonistic elements, Conway brews up a singular materialist tonic. And despite its singularity, her arguments speak to and perhaps answer many of the concerns of contemporary materialism. I will refer to her position for the sake of ease as new model materialism. At the heart of new model materialism, I argue, is the plasticity and perfectibility of nature and the world. Without this perfectibility, she shows, there could be no divine justice in the world. Perhaps the operative term here is in. That is, Conway's new model materialism, which, like her Cambridge Platonist peers, opposes the Calvinist economy of salvation and damnation, comes dangerously close to Ranterism. That is, salvation can occur in the world and need not wait for some otherworldly beyond. The shared soil in which both Ranterism and Quakerism grew requires that Conway separate her views from the former's alleged or real pantheism, antinomianism, and general licentiousness. In what follows, I will show how the success of new model materialism and its separation from Ranterism rests on its ability to track individuals across radical transformations, which it does through an account of individuals as multitudes capable of retaining personal identity even amidst radical change. Section 1, New Model Materialism. Conway's New Model Materialism combines a variety of disparate and perhaps opposing elements drawn from her Cambridge Platonic, Quaker, Kabbalistic, and other influences, not to mention the memory of the English Civil Wars. These threads include a vitalistic materialism, which is neither mechanistic nor covertly dualistic, a plasticity of nature that levels all things in an ongoing reversibility of perfection, but preserves both divine transcendence and creaturely individuation, an economy of divine justice that appropriately rewards and punishes individual creatures across lifetimes, thus avoiding the tyrannical God of Calvinism, and finally, a Quaker pacifism that does not take up the sword of leveling. They blend together around the idea that nature is plastic and perfectible. Conway pits her vitalism in opposition to mechanistic materialism and dualism alike. And as this quote shows, by matter, she means something different from what Hobbes and Descartes mean, namely more than just corporeal extension moved mechanistically, but rather for Conway, matter means life infused at all levels of nature. What appears to be dead matter, for example, a rock or pile of dirt, has an organic principle, that is a vital force. Nothing is a mere machine. A pile of dirt is an ecosystem of microorganisms. The invention of the microscope underwrote Conway's claim that dead matter is a chimera. That which appears to the naked eye to be inorganic stuff reveals microscopically a busy world of tiny creatures. How else, short of celestial influences, does a pool full of water produce fish? Everything emerges from the same material ground. This is because in the beginning, all was leveled, all was commons. Nature did not yet admit distinctions between high and low, noble and villain. She states, and this is quote 2 here, there is one mother, that unique substance or entity from which all things have come forth and of which they are real parts and members, end quote. This description entails, if not pantheism, then at least pan-naturism. All things are parts and members of a unique substance. We are all parts and members of one mother nature. To say that in the beginning, all things were one substance invokes what I will call ontological leveling. Ontological leveling means 1, that all things emerge out of a common material share. 2, even once they have emerged, there remains a plasticity between the things of nature. And 3, individuals are not separate individual substances, but individual parts of nature. Regarding the first point, Conway admits that her new model materialism shares elements in common with Hobbes's mechanical materialism. And I won't read this whole thing, but just focus on the line where she says, yes, we share a lot in common, but I concede that all creatures from the lowest to the highest were originally one substance and consequently could convert and change from one nature to another. And she says, even though Hobbes believes this, that shouldn't make us shy away from holding a similar point. Being from a common root entails pan-naturism, but not necessarily pantheism. Against Hobbes and Spinoza, Conway argues, our philosophy concedes the antecedent of the argument, namely that all kinds of creatures can be changed into one another. Thus, the lowest becomes the highest, and the highest, as it was in its original nature, the lowest according to the pattern and order which divine wisdom has arranged so that one follows another in a fixed sequence. But she disputes the consequent, namely that this entails pantheism. Mutability is the essential attribute of creatures. It distinguishes God the creator and Christ, or Adam Kadmon, the mediator, from created nature, thus avoiding pantheism. 2 issues arise. First, new model materialism offers a reassessment of matter, namely one that does not render it as mere privation, pure passivity, production material, or the source of evil. Applying St. Paul's teaching regarding human beings to all creatures, Conway argues that, quote, the tribes and troops of creatures originate from one blood, end quote. But to be of one blood entails an even more radical conclusion and the second point. Individuals of one species can transform into individuals of another. Limiting an individual to its own species would obscure the glory of creation. Here we encounter the plasticity of nature. But rather than introduce plastic natures to mediate mind and body, as does Henry Moore, Conway renders all of nature plastic. All is matter. Substantial forms do not bring stable essences to it, thus determining their static species categorizations. Instead, categorizations are fluid because species only differ from one another modally. Applying this to the case at hand, high and low, angel and dirt, are continuous modifications of one and the same nature. If and when the mode changes, then the species changes. We see such specific modifications every day in nature. For example, fire changes into air, or stones change into metals, and metals into other metals. The ontological leveling of new model materialism demands that all things had a common root. That is, Mother Nature's children were a real part of her. And even now, species differences are mere modifications of the one Mother Nature. And this is quote 5. And So we see how a certain thing, while always remaining the same substance, can change marvelously in respect to its mode of being, so that a holy and blessed spirit or angel of light may become an evil and cursed spirit of darkness through its own willful actions. We will see how this plays out below with respect to Alexander's horse Bucephalus. For now, we must note the condition of universal sympathy that follows from new model materialism. Conway maintains, and this is 6a, there exists a general unity of all creatures, one with another, such that no one can be separated from his fellow creatures. And I've italicized fellow creatures because, as we'll see, this is a very common ranter salutation. This is because, she argues, there is no vacuum in nature. Separation, indivisibility are not real. This means that everything in nature is sympathetically connected. Conway states, and this is 6b, in addition to this particular love, there is also a certain universal love in all creatures for each other, in spite of that great confusion that resulted from the fall. This surely should follow from the same basic principle that all things are one in virtue of their primary substance or essence, and are like parts or members of the same body. The fall only confuses universal sympathy, but it does not erase it. Creatures retain a trace of this universal love for each other and for all of nature. One must care not only for oneself and one's own salvation, but for one's fellow creatures. Given that the fall does not shackle us with original sin, divine justice does not require hellfire and damnation. The divine tyranny of Calvinism offends any reasonable conception of it. Rather, Conway defends a natural order based on divine wisdom rather than arbitrary tyranny. And in this extended quote, she talks about how even the lowest things, such as dust and sand, are capable of these transformations, and they do so according to a process rather than immediately and instantaneously. And her thinking for this is reflected in this last line that I want to highlight. For in this, the creatures enjoy greater pleasure since they possess what they have as the fruits of their labor. End quote. Despite the general care each individual must feel for all of nature through their own efforts and the fruits of their labors, individual creatures have the ability to enjoy what they possess. Finding pleasure in one's own possession as the fruits of one's labors require that new model materialism distinguish itself from ranterism. Section 2, a common rooting ground. The Ranters and Quakers grew up together from the same soil of the English Civil Wars. The world turned upside down. But unlike the carnivalesque turning the world upside down for amusement, real prospects of revolution seemed imminent. According to the Ranters, God himself is the mighty leveler who, perhaps through us as his instruments, will make all things common. The ranter Abiezer Cope warns in his fiery flying roll, and this is number 8, thus saith the Lord, I inform you that I overturn, overturn, overturn. And as the bishops, Charles, and the lords have had their turn, overturn, so your turn shall be next, ye surviving great ones, by what name or title soever dignified or distinguished, whoever you are, that oppose me, the eternal God, who am universal love, and whose service is perfect freedom and pure libertinism. All shall be overturned, all shall be leveled. The Ranters have a long pedigree, hearkening back to the medieval heresies of the Brethren of the Free Spirit, Joachim of Fiore and the Coming Age of the Holy Spirit, the Rhineland mysticism of Eckhart and Suso, and most immediately to the levelers, giggers, and perhaps even the Quakers. Not only naturism, but a full-fledged pantheism underwrites ranterism. Jacob Bethulme, for example, professes in his Light and Dark Sides of God, and this is number 9, God is in all creatures, man and beast, fish and fowl, every green thing, from the highest cedar to the ivy on the wall, and God is the life and being of them all, and that God doth really dwell, if you will, personally, if ye may admit so low an expression in them all, and hath his being nowhere else out of creatures, end quote. God is not only every green thing, but also he is in seemingly inanimate things, such as a pile of dirt or, quote, this tobacco pipe, end quote. Such pantheism is radical because not only is everything God, and God is everything, but the creaturely modifications of the one Deus Sive Natura turns over and is overturned. There is a reversibility of perfectibility. The high becomes low and the low becomes high. Cope, speaking to the high mountains and lofty cedars, warns them that now is the time for, quote, you to enter into the rocks and hide you in the dust, end quote. This is the last warning piece to the great ones of the earth. With respect to universal sympathy, New Model materialism echoes Ranter ethics as well. Bartholomew tells his reader, the kingdom of heaven is within you, which he parses literally. It does not come in a hereafter, but, quote, we have full and actual possession of it. Also, when Cope proclaims the substantiality of leveling is coming, this is to incite practical transformation. You must, he proclaims, sympathize with the flesh of thy flesh. But despite his professed commitment to pacifism, which he shares with the Quakers, and he says, I engage in neither sword leveling nor digging leveling, he issues a type of speech act that can only be described as a threat. The subtitle of his tract is Word from the Lord to all the great ones of the earth, whom this may concern, being the last warning piece. He tells us that the rogues, thieves, whores, and cut purses are flesh of thy flesh, end quote. From this, he draws an imperative. Each beggar that you meet, fall before him, kiss him in the street. From this, a second and more imperative follows. Turn not thine eyes from thine own flesh, lest I pull out thine eyes and throw thee headlong into hell, end quote. His fiery roll adds a third imperative, tying together the other two. Have all things in common, or else the plague of God will rot and consume all that you have, end quote. The imperative to have all things in common runs against finding pleasure in the possession, and finding pleasure in one's possession as the fruits of one's labor. Thus, against the extreme of Ranterism, Conway seeks to secure the middle path of truth. And I'll just skim this, saying that she opposes in this passage the idea that all things would be identical with God. I will bypass her arguments against pantheism here and instead focus on why her account of divine justice crumbles without robust individuals. Without distinct individuals, the purported claims of the ranters that theft, adultery, and so forth are not sins become easier to justify. What is thine is mine without a thou and a me. Likewise, how can we talk about the perfectibility of one and the same individual, for example, Eucephalus, over different lifespans? Why should I care if some future version of myself or a counterpart with whom I share no continuity suffers for my sins? Despite the plasticity of nature and despite being Mother Nature's children, New Model materialism must countenance a robust account of individuals and personal identity. Section 3, the plasticity of nature. Consider the case of Alexander's horse, Eucephalus. Quote 12, let us imagine a horse, a creature endowed by its creator with different degrees of perfection, such that not only bodily strength, but also certain notions, so to speak, of how to serve his master. In addition, a horse exhibits anger, fear, love, memory, and various other qualities which are in human beings and which we can also observe in dogs and many other animals. Therefore, since the divine power, goodness, and wisdom has created good creatures so that they may continually and infinitely move towards the good through their own mutability, the glory of their attributes shines more and more. Creatures qua mutable continually and endlessly strive toward the good. This perfectibility is only stifled by their own resistance, ataxia, to the impartial will of God operating in them. Conway continues her reasoning. Is a horse a mere machine or dead matter, or does it have some kind of spirit which it possesses thought, sense, love, and various other properties which are appropriate to its spirit? If it has such a spirit, something which must clearly be conceded, what happens to the spirit when it dies? If it is said that it returns to life and obtains the body of another horse, so that it becomes a horse as it was before, but stronger and more beautiful with a better spirit before, excellent. If it dies a second, third, or fourth time, does it always remain a horse, even though it becomes continuously better and more excellent? And how often does its spirit return? End quote. Bucephalus' spirit obtains a new equine body. The principal spirit, enfolded as Bucephalus, however, can unfold not only into stronger and newer equine bodies, but also into other bodily configurations as well. Consider Conway's reasoning for this important claim. With environmental changes, she argues, so too species must change. This is because of a deep and radical interconnectedness of all nature. Quote 14, for if the earth assumes another form and produces no more vegetation, then horses and similar animals will cease to be as they were before. Since they will not have their proper nourishment, they could not remain the same species. And then she goes on to say that, so they have to, because they're not annihilated, they must undergo some sort of transformation. When the earth changes, then horses and other animals, quote, change their configuration along with it, end quote. Shape serves the aspirations of life. But how far does Conway push this plasticity? Species, as we have discussed, are modifications of the one underlying nature. The contemporary position of extreme ascetism holds, for example, that Bucephalus could be a fried egg. In changing his species, does Bucephalus ever become a human or a plant or a fried egg? I'm going to skip over this part of the paper and say that I surmise that Conway does not need to hold this view of extreme ascetism. I would be interested to discuss in conversation whether I'm right about that, because I'm very unsure, well, of all points that I'm talking about, but that one in particular. And I can explain a bit more why I don't think she needs to hold that. Okay. So despite Bucephalus's radical metamorphosis over the course of time, new model materialism must show how he can neither become any other individual nor be leveled into the common share of nature, that is, lose his identity. This would undermine divine justice. If Judas could change into Paul, then we could not punish Judas for his sins. Rewards and punishments are suited to the individual and thus must track them. If Paul became Peter, Paul would not receive his proper reward, but Peter's. Such confusion would be unsuitable to divine wisdom. Although worlds for Conway are not possible worlds, but rather unfoldings of one and the same nature, individuals must persist. Rewarding or punishing one's counterpart would render divine justice tyrannical, much in the same way that Calvinism's damnation of all humans for Adam's sin does. Rather than track individuals across possible worlds, Conway tracks them across various permutations of the actual world unfolding. Thus, against standard framings of ascetism as a modal thesis, imagine the world as qualitatively the same, but somehow different, the somehow here being exeatively, Conway's new model materialism imagines the world exeatively the same, but qualitatively different. It's as if the world as theater retains the same cast performing alternating roles. So long as the same actor performs different roles, and each role can become better without lessening any other role, then divine justice holds. Bucephalus turns over one qualitative role for another while remaining Bucephalus. He swaps husks and shells, but his kernel remains. Recall above how Conway challenged Hobbes's mechanical materialism and Descartes' dualism on account of their failure to move beyond the husk or shell of matter to reach its kernel. What is the husk and what is the kernel? The husk is matter as it extends in a corporeal and seemingly impenetrable fashion. On the contrary, the kernel is matter in its virtual extension. The kernel contains the most noble attributes of nature, spirit or life and light. She parses this as, quote, the capacity for every kind of feeling, perception, knowledge, or even love, all power, joy, and fruition, which the noblest creatures have or can have, even the vilest and most contemptible, end quote. The kernel remains the same, even as the husk and shell change amidst various successive lifespans. An individual extends itself virtually, not by taking up space, which defines corporeal extension, but rather by expressing nature as a whole. As Leibniz will later say about monads, each principal spirit reflects the totality of the world. But for Conway, principal spirits are not little minds, immaterial psyches or souls, apperceiving the entire world. How then do these materialized spirits express nature as a whole? For Conway, they do so through their vital motion, quote 15, but every motion which proceeds from the proper life and will of a creature is vital, and I call this the motion of life, which clearly is neither local nor mechanical like the other kind, but has in itself life and vital power. This is the virtual extension of the creature, which is greater or lesser according to the degree or kind or degree of life which the creature is endowed. For when a creature attains a more noble kind or degree of life, it acquires greater power and ability to move itself and transmit its vital motions to the greatest distance, end quote. We must immediately parse lines that could be easily misconstrued. To transmit vital motions to the greatest distance does not mean acting at a distance. This is what she means here by neither local nor mechanical motion. Instead, a principal spirit transmits vital motions to a greater distance by extending its sympathy for a nature as a whole and for its fellow creatures. Second, we must consider what she means by a creature having a greater degree of vital motion according to the kind or degree of life. As we saw above, to become more spiritual does not mean transcending nature in the natural world, either in the sense of monastically forfeiting it or in the sense of instrumentally dominating it, but rather it means extending one's powers by embracing nature as a whole. This is because no creature is solipsistically or monadically self-contained, but each one virtually extends into its environment. Every creature is a multitude. Ontologically speaking, each creature needs its fellow creatures. Conway states, but a creature, because it needs the help of its fellow creatures, must be multiple in order to receive this help. For whatever receives something is nourished by it and thus becomes part of it. Therefore, it is no longer one thing, but many, and many indeed as the things which it receives, and even greater than that. Thus, there's a certain mutuality between creatures in giving and receiving, through which one supports another so that one can't live without the other. What creature in the universe can be found which does not need its fellow creature? Certainly none, end quote. Here, New Model Materialism treats us to a much different ontology than the solipsism of much of modern philosophy. Rather than begin with Descartes' cogito, Hobbes's atoms, Locke's persons bound by consciousness, or even Leibniz's monads, Conway builds multiplicity into the very foundation of individuals. Each creature is not merely a mirror of the universe, but instead vitally interconnected with nature as a whole. Each creature must be inherently a multiplicity to be part of the universe. This means that multiplicity is not secondary to or that it follows upon prior identity. Rather, it constitutes the very structure of each principal spirit. Against the obscenity of mind as the private chamber of one's own thoughts, beliefs, desires, and so forth, spirit vitally extends into its environment. That is, to be enmeshed in the environment is inseparable from the constitution of any creature. One extends one's powers not by domination and destruction, but by confederating oneself with others through universal sympathies with, quote, my fellow creatures. At the risk of making the boundaries between individuals too blurry, perhaps New Model Materialism can pacify the concern that every unity, no matter how weak, lays claim to reality. An easy solution, and one that Conway discusses, is that the principal spirit of the individual would be atomic, while guiding over the confederation that constitutes individuals as a whole. The smaller parts can quickly come and go, even larger ones can be gained or lost, but the principal spirit remains the same. It is the unity for multiplicity. But Conway demurs. The principal spirit, she argues, must also be a multiplicity. This is because it is substantially and essentially part of one Mother Nature. And while individuals do emerge and do retain diachronic identity from out of nature, they are not individual substances in the Cartesian or scholastic sense of the term. The principal spirit is a multiplicity, not only because it reflects or expresses nature as a whole, but because it is virtually extended amongst it. That is, it is a power capable of reaching all of thy fellow creatures through its vital motion. Vital motions do not require dominating other bodies and lessening their share, but rather requires communing with flesh, the flesh of thy flesh. Each actor can be distinguished through its peculiar patterns of vital motion, how it communes with its fellow creatures or fails to do so. And creatures fail to do so when they suffer from ataxia. Conclusion, I'll be quick with this one. I will conclude by showing how reward and punishment are suited to an individual and how divine justice tracks it across various permutations and specific modifications. This happens because punishment does not come from outside the individual, nor does reward. For new model materialism, tracking individuals does not occur from a transcendent source. Rather, Bucephalus's reward and Alexander's punishment are tailored to them because they arise from within themselves as continuations of their patterns of movement. Remember, spirits are not Leibniz's little minds, which express the entire universe through apperception and appetite. Instead, they peculiarly express the universe to a greater or lesser extent through their patterns of motion. What bonds that multiplicity as an indissoluble principal spirit, a center point of intersecting line, is the law of justice inscribed in it. The law of justice stamps such patterns in nature, which allows for individual tracking and thus reward and punishment to occur immanently within such patterns of motion themselves. As each principal spirit is a multiplicity bonded by the inscription of divine justice, it must move according to this internal law of motion. When it does not, and thus sins, it suffers ataxia. Ataxia is the disorderly direction of motion. Medically speaking, it means the disorder of bodily functions. One with ataxia lacks coordination, balance, or speech. One lacks tactics by which to coordinate their movements with their immediate environment and nature as a whole. Ataxia results not from the failure to fall in line with patterns of motion expressed around oneself. That is, being out of step with unjust laws and conventions is not ataxic so long as one's movement is coordinated to nature. Vital motion moves from the internal principle of divine justice stamped upon each creature. The ranter Bethune is thus partially correct in his loss of the kingdom of heaven is at hand. That is, the nature is made spiritual here and now, and not in some eternal beyond. To have the power of action means overcoming ataxia and moving with sympathy for nature as a whole. The world can be made better, and perhaps it does, even without taking up the sword of leveling, but this is a discussion for another day. Thank you.